February 3rd, 1876. Magnolia Grove Plantation, Natchez, Mississippi. This is the true story of the Natchez Massacre, the night one man's rage became a reckoning that shook Mississippi to its core. Before we dive into this incredible story of vengeance and justice, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories of resistance and rebellion. The winter of 1876 was brutal in Mississippi. Snow covered the cotton fields that stretched from Natchez to Vicksburg, turning the landscape into a white wasteland that matched the coldness in men's hearts. Reconstruction was officially over, federal troops had been withdrawn, and the old ways were creeping back like shadows at sunset. Magnolia Grove Plantation sat on 2,000 acres of prime Mississippi River bottomland, worked by nearly 300 former slaves who had nowhere else to go when freedom came. The master's house still stood proud on its hill, white columns gleaming even in winter, while down in the quarters, families huddled in cabins that were no better than they had been during slavery. The quarters themselves were a collection of one-room shanties, built in neat rows like grave markers in a cemetery. Each cabin housed an entire family in conditions that would shame animals. Dirt floors, no windows, roofs that leaked rain and snow, walls so thin that winter wind cut through them like knives. This was freedom in 1876 Mississippi. The same cabins, the same work, the same masters, just different words to describe the same reality. Sharecropping, they called it now. Tenant farming, debt peonage, pretty names for ugly truths that kept black families trapped in a system that was slavery by another name. Ezra Johnson lived in cabin number 47 with his wife Sarah, his 3 children, and his elderly mother, who had been born in the original slave quarters 60 years earlier. 5 people in a space smaller than most closets today, surviving on scraps and hope, and the fading promise that someday things would be better. Ezra had been born on Magnolia Grove in 1834, the son of a field hand named Moses and a house servant named Ruth. His childhood had been the typical nightmare of enslaved children. Work from dawn to dusk, beatings for the smallest infractions, the constant fear that family members would be sold away without warning. When the Civil War ended and freedom came, Ezra had been 31 years old, illiterate, unskilled in anything except cotton farming, with a wife and newborn child to support. Like millions of other former slaves, he had discovered that legal freedom meant nothing without economic freedom, that liberation was meaningless when you had nowhere to go and no way to survive. So he had stayed at Magnolia Grove, signing a sharecropping contract that tied him to the land as surely as chains had once tied him to his master. The contract was simple, brutal, designed to keep him in permanent debt to the plantation store, the plantation housing, the plantation system that had simply found new ways to own human souls. The overseers were the enforcers of this new slavery, men hired to keep the workforce in line through fear, violence, and the kind of casual cruelty that had characterized the old system. They were led by Marcus Whitfield, a man who had learned his trade during the worst days of slavery and saw no reason to change his methods just because the law had changed. Whitfield was assisted by 3 other men, each one chosen for his willingness to use violence against black families who stepped out of line. There was James Crawford, who specialized in night raids on cabins where he suspected resistance was brewing. Samuel Brooks, who used sexual violence against women and girls to maintain control through terror, and Thomas Reed, who took special pleasure in tormenting children, believing that broken spirits started young. These 4 men ruled the quarters with absolute authority, backed by local law enforcement that turned a blind eye to their methods, and state governments that actively encouraged the suppression of black rights. They carried weapons, rode horses, lived in comfortable houses while the people they terrorized froze in unheated cabins. Most importantly, they believed they were untouchable, protected by law, custom, and the simple reality that no black man had ever successfully challenged their authority and lived to tell about it. They had forgotten that slavery had ended not through white generosity but through black resistance, that freedom had been won by people who had decided that death was better than continued bondage. Ezra Johnson had been watching, waiting, planning for this moment since the day he had signed his sharecropping contract 11 years earlier. He had endured their insults, their violence, their constant humiliation of his family. He had bit his tongue when they cheated him at the plantation store, stealing his earnings through inflated prices and creative accounting. He had remained silent when they violated his wife, beat his children, treated his elderly mother like an animal. But patience has limits even for the most broken men, and Ezra Johnson's patience had finally run out. The final straw came on the evening of February the 2nd, when Samuel Brooks decided to make an example out of Ezra's 14-year-old daughter, Lucy. The girl's crime was looking him in the eye when he spoke to her, a sign of disrespect that could not be tolerated in the new Mississippi. Brooks had dragged Lucy from her family's cabin, stripped her naked in the February cold, and tied her to a post in the center of the quarters where everyone could see. Then he had begun to whip her with a leather strap, each blow accompanied by lectures about knowing her place, accepting white authority, understanding that freedom for her kind was an illusion. Ezra had been forced to watch, held at gunpoint, by Crawford and Reed while his daughter screamed and bled in the freezing night air. Brooks had taken his time, savoring every cry of pain, every plea for mercy, every moment of a father's helpless rage. When it was over, when Lucy hung unconscious from her bonds, Brooks had walked over to Ezra and whispered in his ear, "That's what happens to uppity niggers who think they're free. Remember that, boy. Remember who really runs this place." That night, while Sarah tended to Lucy's wounds and his mother wept quietly in the corner, Ezra Johnson made his decision. He had tried patience, tried accommodation, tried finding ways to survive within the system. But some systems could not be survived, only destroyed. Some injustices could not be endured, only ended. He waited until the early morning hours, when the overseers would be making their rounds, checking for signs of escape or rebellion, asserting their dominance over people who dared to sleep without permission. It was their habit to enter cabins without knocking, to search through belongings without cause, to remind everyone that privacy was a privilege reserved for white folks. Ezra had prepared carefully for this moment. Hidden beneath his cabin was a woodcutter's axe, sharp and heavy, the kind of tool he used every day to cut firewood for the master's house. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose, would become an instrument of justice in hands that had been forced to serve injustice for too long. The first overseer to die was Thomas Reed, the man who specialized in tormenting children. He entered Ezra's cabin at exactly 3 o'clock, expecting to find a family of broken sharecroppers cowering in the darkness. Instead, he found Ezra Johnson waiting by the door, axe in hand, 42 years of accumulated rage finally finding its target. Reed had time to see the axe rising, time to understand what was about to happen, time to open his mouth for a scream. That never came. The blade caught him in the neck, nearly severing his head from his shoulders, sending blood spraying across the cabin walls like paint from a broken brush. The second blow split his skull down the middle, dropping him to the dirt floor in a heap of twitching limbs and spreading blood. Ezra Johnson had drawn first blood in a war that had been brewing for 11 years, since the day he had learned that freedom was just another word for a different kind of slavery. Samuel Brooks was next, the man who had violated his wife and tortured his daughter. He was making his rounds on horseback, moving between cabins like a wolf prowling among sheep, when Ezra emerged from the shadows like death itself. The axe took the horse's front legs first, sending Brooks tumbling to the frozen ground in a tangle of screaming animal and cursing man. Before he could regain his feet, before he could draw his pistol, Ezra was on him, the axe rising and falling with mechanical precision. Brooks tried to beg, tried to bargain, tried to promise better treatment, if Ezra would just stop the killing. But Ezra Johnson was past the point of negotiation, beyond the reach of pleas or threats. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, had chosen a path that led only to death or freedom, with no middle ground between them. The axe found Brooks's ribs, his spine, his skull. Each blow was a payment on a debt that had been accumulating for years, interest compounding with every humiliation, every beating, every violation of human dignity. When Ezra was finished, Samuel Brooks was no longer recognizable as a human being, just pieces of meat scattered across the frozen ground. James Crawford heard the screaming and came running, pistol drawn, ready to restore order through superior firepower and righteous violence. He had broken up slave rebellions before, had killed black men who forgot their place, had earned his reputation through consistent brutality, applied without mercy or remorse. But Crawford had never faced a man like Ezra Johnson, someone who had finally decided that death was preferable to continued degradation, that violence was the only language their oppressors understood, that some battles had to be fought regardless of the odds. Crawford got off one shot, the bullet grazing Ezra's shoulder and spinning him around like a dancer. But pain was nothing new to a man who had been whipped, beaten, and tortured for 42 years. If anything, the wound only sharpened his focus, reminded him why he was fighting, what he was trying to protect. The axe caught Crawford in the chest, splitting him open like a log, revealing the black heart that had pumped cruelty through his veins for so many years. He fell backward over a woodpile, his body landing in pieces, his blood steaming in the cold February air. Marcus Whitfield was the last to die, the leader of the overseers, the architect of the system that had kept Ezra's family in bondage long after slavery had officially ended. He had been sleeping in his comfortable house when the shooting started, had been slow to respond because he could not imagine any scenario where his authority might be challenged. By the time Whitfield reached the quarters, 3 of his men were dead, and Ezra Johnson was waiting for him with an axe that dripped blood and vengeance in equal measure. The head overseer drew his own weapon, a rifle that had killed dozens of black men over the years, but his hands were shaking with fear and disbelief. "You crazy nigger," Whitfield shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "You know what they'll do to you for this? You know how you're gonna die?" Ezra Johnson looked at him with eyes that held no fear, no regret, no recognition of white authority. "I've been dead for 42 years, he said quietly. "Tonight, I came back to life." The axe took Whitfield's rifle first, splitting the wooden stock and sending the weapon spinning away into the darkness. The second swing caught him in the stomach, folding him in half like a piece of paper. The third and final blow separated his head from his shoulders, ending the reign of terror that had held the quarters in fear for more than a decade. 4 men, 4 lives, 4 representatives of a system that had tried to reinvent slavery under new names and prettier laws, all dead in less than an hour, all brought down by a single black man who had finally decided that enough was enough. Ezra Johnson stood in the middle of the carnage, the axe heavy in his hands, his clothes soaked with the blood of his enemies. Around him, the quarters had gone silent, except for the sound of wind through the cabins and the distant lowing of cattle who had been awakened by the violence. Doors began to open slowly, cautiously. Faces appeared in windows, eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. The people who lived in the quarters had just witnessed the impossible. One of their own had killed the white men who terrorized them, had proven that their oppressors were mortal, that resistance was possible even in 1876 Mississippi. Ezra's wife Sarah was the first to approach him, moving carefully through the scattered body parts, stepping around pools of blood that were already beginning to freeze in the winter cold. She took the axe from his hands gently like disarming a child and looked into his eyes. "What now?" she whispered. Ezra Johnson looked around at the people who had emerged from their cabins, at the families who had lived in fear for so long, at the children who had grown up believing that white authority was absolute and black resistance was impossible. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the cold morning air. "Now we're free," he said simply. "Really free. For the first time since the war ended." The people of the quarters understood what Ezra had done, what it meant, what would happen next. They had perhaps hours before word of the massacre reached Natchez, before armed white men came looking for revenge, before the full weight of Mississippi justice fell on their community. But for this moment, in the gray light of dawn on February 3, 1876, they were free. Free from the overseers who had terrorized them, free from the system that had kept them in bondage, free to make their own choices about what came next. Some families began packing immediately, gathering their few possessions and preparing to run north toward states where black lives had more value, where the law offered some protection against white violence. Others chose to stay and fight, to defend their homes and their freedom against whatever force came to restore the old order. Ezra Johnson made his own choice. He would not run, would not hide, would not allow his family to live as fugitives from justice. That was no justice at all. He had struck the first blow in a war that had been coming for 11 years, had proven that black men could fight back when pushed beyond endurance. If they wanted him, they would have to come and get him. And when they came, they would find him ready, axe in hand, surrounded by people who had finally remembered what freedom meant. The news of the massacre reached Natchez by noon, carried by a white farmhand who had discovered the bodies while making a delivery to the plantation store. Within hours, armed posses were forming in the city, men who saw the killings not as acts of resistance, but as unprovoked attacks on white authority that demanded swift and terrible punishment. The state militia was called out. Newspapers screamed. About black savagery and white victimhood, politicians denounced the murders as evidence that former slaves were unfit for freedom. The same narrative that had justified slavery was now being used to justify its restoration. The same arguments that had once defended the peculiar institution, now serving to defend its ghostly remnant. But something had changed in the quarters of Magnolia Grove, something that no amount of white violence could completely destroy. The people had seen one of their own refuse to accept the unacceptable, had witnessed proof that their oppressors were mortal, that resistance was possible even when it seemed suicidal. When the militia arrived 3 days later, they found the plantation deserted. The cabins were empty, the fields abandoned, the workforce vanished like morning mist. Some families had fled north, others had scattered across the countryside. A few had joined armed groups that were forming in the Mississippi backwoods. Ezra Johnson was gone, disappeared with his family into the maze of swamps and forests that covered much of rural Mississippi. Some said he had made it to Canada, that he lived out his days in freedom among other refugees from American injustice. Others believed he had been killed in the fighting that followed, that he had died, as he had lived, with an axe in his hand and defiance in his heart. The truth was both simpler and more complex. Ezra Johnson had achieved something that transcended physical escape or death. He had shown that resistance was possible, that individual acts of courage could change the course of history, that even the most oppressive systems contained the seeds of their own destruction. His rebellion had lasted only an hour, but its effects rippled through decades. The story of the Natchez Massacre spread through black communities across the South, inspiring countless others to choose resistance over submission, dignity over safety, freedom over the illusion of security. The massacre marked the beginning of the end for the sharecropping system in Mississippi, not because it destroyed the economic foundations of neo-slavery, but because it destroyed the psychological foundations. Once black people had seen that white authority was not absolute, that their oppressors could be killed, that resistance was possible, the system began to crack. Other plantations reported similar incidents in the months that followed. Overseers, found dead in fields, beaten to death with farming tools. White landowners discovered hanging from trees, lynched by the same people they had been lynching for years. Armed black groups forming in the countryside, fighting pitched battles with white militia units. The violence escalated on both sides, each atrocity justifying greater atrocities, each act of resistance met with increasingly brutal repression. But the genie was out of the bottle, the lesson of Ezra Johnson's rebellion spreading like wildfire through communities that had been taught to accept their oppression as natural and inevitable. The children who grew up hearing stories of the Natchez Massacre carried its lessons forward into the 20th century, into the Great Migration that would reshape American demographics, into the civil rights movement that would finally destroy the legal foundations of white supremacy. Ezra's son Samuel, who had been 12 years old on the night of the massacre, lived to see the end of segregation, fought in both world wars, and spent his later years telling anyone who would listen about his father, the man who had proven that black men could fight back. Samuel's own children became teachers, doctors, lawyers, activists. They carried their grandfather's legacy forward into battles for voting rights, equal education, fair employment, all the freedoms that Ezra Johnson had killed and died to make possible. The great-grandchildren of slaves who had witnessed the Natchez Massacre grew up to be freedom riders, sit-in protesters, marchers who walked from Selma to Montgomery carrying signs that demanded the same dignity their ancestors had been willing to kill for. In our own time, Ezra Johnson's story continues to resonate, reminding us that individual acts of resistance can change the course of history, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they find the courage to say no to injustice. His rebellion was not pretty, not peaceful, not politically correct. It was violent, bloody, final. But it was also necessary, inspiring, transformative. He had chosen violence because violence had been chosen for him, had used the master's tools to destroy the master's house, had proven that oppression always contains the seeds of its own destruction. The system that replaced sharecropping was not perfect, was still marked by inequality and injustice, and the lingering poison of racial hatred. But it was better than what came before, more responsive to demands for change, more vulnerable to sustained pressure from below. That progress came not through the goodwill of those in power, but through the resistance of those without power, through people like Ezra Johnson who decided that some battles had to be fought regardless of the cost, that some injustices could not be endured, only ended. His story challenges us to examine our own times, our own compromises, our own moments of choosing between safety and dignity. It asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of resistance, the role of violence in social change, the responsibility of the oppressed to resist their oppression. Most importantly, it reminds us that change comes not from above but from below, not from the mercy of oppressors but from the courage of the oppressed, not from hoping for better times, but from making better times through struggle and sacrifice, and the willingness to pay whatever price freedom demands. The overseers' bodies were eventually found and buried, their deaths mourned by families who genuinely believed they had been good men doing necessary work. Their tombstones spoke of faithful service, Christian virtue, tragic ends to productive lives. But in the quarters where they had ruled through fear, where they had broken spirits and destroyed families and turned human beings into livestock, their deaths were remembered differently. They were seen as the beginning of justice, the first payment on a debt that slavery had run up over centuries, the proof that even gods could bleed when mortals found the courage to fight back. The plantation itself never recovered from the massacre. Magnolia Grove was abandoned within a year, its fields reverting to wilderness, its great house eventually collapsing under the weight of time and neglect. Where once cotton had grown in neat rows tended by enslaved hands, now trees and vines reclaimed the land, erasing the evidence of human bondage beneath layers of green growth. But the memory of what had happened there lived on, passed down through generations of families who had learned from Ezra Johnson's example that resistance was possible, that dignity was worth fighting for, that freedom was not given but taken by those brave enough to seize it. Today, more than 140 years later, the site of Magnolia Grove is a nature preserve, its bloody history known only to local historians and the descendants of the people who lived and died there. Visitors walk trails where cotton rows once stretched to the horizon, never knowing that beneath their feet lies soil that was once soaked with the blood of both oppressors and oppressed. But the spirit of what happened on that cold February morning lives on, carried forward by every generation that must choose between submission and resistance, between accepting injustice and fighting to change it. Ezra Johnson's rebellion reminds us that individual courage can change the world, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they find something worth fighting for. His story is not comfortable, not easy to digest for those who prefer their heroes peaceful and their justice nonviolent, but it is honest, necessary, transformative. It speaks to the reality of oppression and the necessity of resistance, to the truth that some battles must be fought with whatever weapons are available, that some freedoms can only be won through blood and sacrifice. In our own time, when injustice still exists in new forms, when oppression still thrives under different names, when the powerful still exploit the powerless, Ezra Johnson's example reminds us that resistance is always possible, that individual acts of courage can inspire mass movements, that the arc of history bends toward justice only when people like him are willing to bend it. He died as he chose to die, fighting for his family's freedom, proving that Black lives had value, demonstrating that human dignity could not be destroyed, no matter how much violence was used to crush it. His rebellion was brief, costly, irreversible, but it was also necessary, inspiring, transformative. The massacre in the Natchez slave quarters was more than just 4 deaths on a winter morning. It was a declaration of independence, a refusal to accept the unacceptable, a reminder that every system of oppression depends on the consent of the oppressed, and that when that consent is withdrawn, even the most powerful systems can be shaken to their foundations. Ezra Johnson shook those foundations with an axe in his bare hands, with courage and desperation, and the desperate love of a father who would rather die than watch his children grow up in chains. His choice echoes still, challenging us to find our own courage, to choose our own battles, to decide what we are willing to fight for and what price we are willing to pay for freedom. If this incredible story of resistance and rebellion has moved you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from American history. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that individual courage can change the world, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to accept injustice. Let us know in the comments what you think about Ezra's choice. Was he a hero or a criminal? Was his violence justified, or was there another way? These are difficult questions that every generation must answer for itself, but they are questions worth asking, conversations worth having. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest videos exploring the hidden stories that shaped our nation. From slave rebellions to freedom struggles, from individual acts of defiance to mass movements for change, we bring you the human drama behind the history books. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to accept the unacceptable. Ezra Johnson understood that. His story reminds us that we all have choices to make, that dignity matters more than safety, that freedom is worth whatever price it demands. In the end, the massacre in the Natchez slave quarters was not just about 4 dead overseers. It was about one man's refusal to let his family live as property, one father's determination to show his children that resistance was possible, one human being's decision to choose death over dishonor. That choice reverberates still, inspiring all who believe that justice is worth fighting for, that dignity is worth dying for, that some battles must be fought regardless of the cost. Ezra Johnson's legacy lives on in every person who refuses to bow down to oppression, who chooses resistance over submission, who understands that freedom is not a gift but a right that must be defended by those brave enough to stand up and fight.